All right, I've officially started Chapter 7 in Fire in California's ecosystems. This next chapter is going to be going into the interactions fire has with soil, water, and air. And I will do a little introduction to this chapter in a moment, but first I do want to get into the red flag warning that we had throughout this last weekend in California and is actually still ongoing down in parts of Southern California. So maybe I should just update SoCal's conditions first, and then we could talk about what happened in Northern California. So in Southern California, we do still have some gusty Santa Ana winds through, it looks like 10 p.m. on Monday, although the windiest conditions were throughout the day today, Sunday. And then we are still going to have some gusty winds, low relative humidity tomorrow. So anytime you have gusty winds, dry air, that increases your chances for fires to start, and then if fires do start, they're going to spread a lot more rapidly. And that is why this time of the year can be a dangerous time for wildfire, especially because a lot of these offshore wind events will actually be strongest during the overnight hours, because during the afternoon you can sometimes get winds going upslope, and that kind of cancels out the effects of the winds going downslope. Whereas overnight, you get the downslope winds along with the winds that naturally do usually go down into your valleys during the overnight hours because your hillsides cool off and then that cool air kind of sinks down. So then it's sort of a double whammy of winds during the overnight hours. So why would that be more dangerous? Well, it's more dangerous because people are asleep at nighttime. So instead of the summertime fire behavior where it's usually most active in the afternoon when maybe people have been listening to the forecast throughout the morning, they see the fire picking up in intensity throughout the entire day, they've been watching the smoke column throughout the entire day. These offshore wind events can be a bit dangerous because you can get very gusty winds, very dry conditions during the overnight hours. So people might be asleep, they don't know a fire is happening, then all of a sudden they're either trying to do an evacuation at the last minute, or maybe they don't even hear that they're supposed to evacuate, and then obviously that can lead to some dangerous conditions there. But that is still ongoing down in Southern California, but up in Northern California, I'd say we lucked out with this one. The red flag warning throughout much of NorCal has now expired, so I feel safe in saying that, because we did end up having some pretty, you could say, some of the more extreme wildfire conditions that we've had throughout the season. I was following the winds very closely in the North Bay, the East Bay, parts of Northern California, up in the Sierra, and I was seeing continuous winds around maybe 40, 50 miles per hour. I believe the strongest gust that I saw was maybe 62 or 63 miles per hour. And then at the exact same time, we had a lot of very dry air moving into California, and especially throughout the day today. Today was some of the driest air I've seen in a while. We had relative humidity drop down to maybe 15, 17% in some places. I think those were some of the lowest values that I saw. So once again, we had windy conditions, dry conditions. The reason that's bad for fire danger is because when it's dry, the air is dry, which kind of pulls some moisture out of your finer fuels, the fuels that respond to the atmosphere more quickly. So then you can have a fire ignition. It's easier for the ignition to happen because when you maybe have some heat source, it doesn't have to evaporate as much moisture out of the plant before combustion can occur. The drier the plant is, the easier it is for that plant to just catch on fire. And we could go into the science behind combustion, but I think anybody who's ever done a campfire pretty much knows that. If you have a moist log and a dry log, it's much easier to start the fire with the dry log. And it's also easier to start the fire with your finer fuels. And that's what I was talking about, where that's where you could get ignitions happening. And then the reason winds make that dangerous is winds can provide more oxygen to the fire. They can push the flames forward, and then they can also pick up burning embers and start new little spot fires. And then the spot fires are more likely to start new ignitions the drier the fuels are. So it's almost like this positive feedback loop, along with the fact that wind can also help evaporate some moisture out of your fuels. So that's all to say that we did have some kind of more dangerous fire conditions throughout this last weekend. Over the last 2 days, we had widespread red flag warnings throughout Northern California. But you might have been able to pick up on the fact that in my video yesterday that I wasn't actually all that worried about it. I was trying to kind of hedge my bets a little bit by talking about how much better our fuel conditions are this year as opposed to last year, because I do subscribe to this one machine learning extreme wildfire forecast model, and although it knew it was going to be windy and low relative humidity, out of maybe 5 or 6 levels, it was maybe putting our fire danger at a 2 or a 3. And that might seem counterintuitive. 50, 60 mile per hour winds, relative humidity around 15%. You would think that'd be prime wildfire conditions. But there's a huge component there, and that's your fuel moistures. And our fuel moistures are in a much better position right now than they have been. But I'd love to see a comparison with all the different years throughout this last decade, but just comparing it to last year, we know we're in a lot better of a position. We picked up a lot more rainfall this last winter, in some cases 2 to 3 times as much. And then we weirdly had just continuous little systems bringing rainfall to California over the last maybe 10 months. Usually we really die off during summer, and then there's maybe no rainfall till late October or November. And we didn't really have any huge rainstorms aside from Tropical Storm Hillary that brought some rain into Southern California. That might help us out with the red flag that we still have going on down there right now. Little moisture moved into our fuels from that system. But we had some late winter storms. We had even a couple spring systems pop up. We had some thunderstorm activity that dropped some rain up in Northern California. And then we've had a pretty great start to fall. Throughout October, I lost count. I think we've had maybe 5 or 6 systems that haven't brought a lot of rainfall to California. I wouldn't really say we've had our first big rainstorm of the year yet, but we've had maybe 5 or 6 wetting rains, especially up in Northern California, that in some cases have brought maybe 1 to 2 inches, especially on the northwestern coast. And actually that northwestern coast was the key place that I was watching over the last couple of months, because that was the last little bit of drought that we had remaining in California. And with those systems that came through in this last month, the drought is officially done in California. I'm happy to say that. And it is just interesting comparing it to where we were this time last year. This time last year, 100% of the state was in moderate drought, 92% of the state was in severe drought. Right now, 0% of the state in any drought category whatsoever. And given this start to fall with all this rain we've already been picking up, even if it has been small amounts, it seems like it's setting the stage for what may happen this next winter. And we are in an El Nino year. It looks like it may even be a strong El Nino. And when that happens, we have an above average chance of precipitation, or above average rainfall is expected. That doesn't mean it's a guarantee that it's going to be a rainy winter. It just means that the scales are tilted in our favor if we do want rain in California. And I would say that is usually at the top of our list, usually with rain, especially in California, because we pick up a lot of rainfall in just a few big storms, the atmospheric rivers that come through. It does lead to some flooding, but if you're weighing all the different possibilities for California, we'd probably take some flooding in order to have a better water supply, full reservoirs, and decrease fire danger. Although, obviously, it'd be great if we could mitigate everything at the same time. But as I've learned, it doesn't seem like there's any real solutions. There's only trade-offs. And I'll maybe get into that a little bit later as well. So, basic summary was we had the red flag up in Northern California over the last 2 days. We did have windy conditions, we did have dry conditions, but we didn't see any extreme wildfires pop up. And I'd say a big part of the reason for that is because of the rain that we've been able to pick up so far this fall, and the fact that our fuels do have a lot more moisture in them than they did have at this time last year. And we are still waiting for that first good rain of the year. So I'm not saying that fire season is over at this point. I'm just saying we're doing pretty well. Now, there you could put the question mark on what is well, what is good, because I'm always tempted to say, oh, our 5-year average for acres burned in California is 1.5 million acres at this point in time. And this year we've only burned around 300,000 acres. So this was a good fire season. But it's hard to use terms like good or bad because it depends on the time scale that you're talking about. So obviously, in the short run, in terms of life and property lost, this was, or I do know a few lives were lost this last fire season. But in terms of acres burned, if we're just going to use acres burned as our metric, you could say in the short run, great fire season. Very little acres burned. There wasn't as much threat to life and property. The large fires that we did have weren't in the very highly populated areas. So yeah, it was a nice fire season. You probably didn't hear about too many big fires over the last, 5 months when you normally would have. But if you change your time scale, then the fact that we didn't burn very many acres this year could actually be viewed as a bad thing. Because what fuel we don't burn in the short run is just going to continue to accumulate in the long run. And then we also know that in the long run, if trends continue, which it looks like they're going to, things are just going to be warmer and drier. And then the fuel that would have that accumulates will then be set to burn in a more extreme climate and atmosphere. So it's almost better that it would almost be better for us to burn as much fuel as possible right now so that there's less fuel around when things get warmer and drier and wildfire becomes more extreme. Or I should say extreme wildfire becomes more likely. So whether this last wildfire season is good or bad really depends on the time scale you're talking about. Maybe great in the short run, maybe not so good in the long run. But there are solutions to that because I have seen a lot of prescribed burns popping up on the Watch Duty app. So it does sound like we're taking advantage of some of these favorable conditions that we've had. Obviously, maybe not this last weekend. I don't think they're doing any prescribed burnings during a red flag event. But during October, I've certainly noticed this, where it's warm enough and dry enough that we could put fire on the ground. The fire could sustain combustion. But it's also not super windy, so there, unless it's a big offshore wind event like what we had the last couple days. And that we've had favorable fire conditions from a prescribed burning perspective over this last month. In terms of we're able to have fire, but it's not as likely that it turns into some extreme fire that gets out of control and then gives prescribed burning a bad rap. And that, I would say, is the trend that hopefully we'll start to see a lot more of in California, where maybe the average person is okay with maybe some poor air quality in the short run due to a prescribed burn, knowing that those prescribed burns would be clearing out fuels that would be burning in the future and would likely be burning in the future under much more extreme conditions, perhaps at a time when we wouldn't want them to. So the trade-off there is, would you rather burn your fuels now under more controlled conditions, or would you wait for those fuels to burn in the future when there's more fuel, it's warmer, drier, and it may be burning on a day where we wouldn't want it to happen, like it burns under red flag conditions and it overwhelms our ability to suppress it. So no real solutions, only trade-offs. And that does kind of tie into what I was reading in Fire in California's Ecosystem. Started chapter 7. It's talking about fire's impact on soil, water, and air. And I'll maybe just get into a couple of examples of the interactions between those two that I've maybe learned in the past, and then I know as I read this next chapter I'm going to be learning a lot more. So the classic one is kind of combines a lot of things together: vegetation, soil, water. It's after a fire comes through, it clears out a lot of the vegetation that would be holding the hillside in place with its root systems. So as those plants are cleared out, then there's nothing holding that hillside in place anymore. So then when you get a big rainstorm, that's your water aspect, instead of a lot of that water being maybe absorbed by the soil or maybe used by the plants and the root systems holding that hillside in place, what it does is it saturates the soil, and then it just turns into a big mudslide or a debris flow, whatever you want to call it. So that right there, perfect example of how fire can impact your soils and your plants for that matter. And it also leads to more runoff overall than overall percolation. I think that I said that right. And then that would be maybe your soil and water impacts. Another one for air. It's kind of what I was talking about earlier, where fire has big impacts on air quality. Obviously, when there's a fire, you get a lot of smoke in the air. That can be harmful for humans. But then that is one of those aspects where it's trade-offs, where it's, would we rather have some smoke today due to some prescribed burning because they're clearing out some fuels, or would we rather wait for the future, kind of kick the can down the road, and then there's a huge wildfire in the future where the air quality ends up being much worse? So no real solutions, only trade-offs. And the assumption that I'm using in that argument is that in California, fire is a natural part of the California ecosystem. So we can't just hold it back forever. It'd almost be like trying to continually build up a dam for a river that continues to flow, and eventually that river is just going to overflow. So it's not a matter of if you're going to have fire in California, but when you're going to have fire in California. And I think an exciting idea that I've been learning about in this textbook, and I've been learning about from fire experts on the internet and people I've been lucky enough to talk to in my own life, is that using some of the advanced technology that we have today, we could start to transition into a future where we eliminate or suppress fire when it is dangerous, when it's maybe going to be a threat to life and property or has the risk of getting out of control. It's one of those days where you don't want a fire burning. But then we can use the same technology to decide when we might allow a fire to burn, or when we're going to put fire on the ground. Maybe when the air quality impacts won't be as great to populations, when there's much less risk of the fire getting out of control. And then some current research that's being done right now is showing that even as the climate continues to warm and dry out, which would make wildfire more extreme, if we were to take responsible steps towards reducing our fuels, we could actually not only cancel out that warming and drying effect, but we could actually have a future with less extreme wildfire. And that's a future that I would prefer to live in, as long as the solutions that we're putting in place match the natural fire regimes that are in place throughout California on localized scales. And that's something I have been learning about in this textbook. I'm going to continue to learn about in this textbook. So if you want to learn more as well, you can stay tuned, and thanks for watching.